Hey guys, tonight we're going to be working on another review session. I know we did one yesterday. We talked about rounding decimals. Tonight we're going to be talking about when we take decimals and fractions and we have to put them in order. And one way we're going to be doing that is on a number line. So let's go ahead and get started. So I came up with some numbers that we see a lot. Let me put this a little closer so you guys can see it. Notice we have 6 different numbers. A lot of times when people get a lot of numbers, they get really overwhelmed. But one strategy I like to use is a number line, because when you put a number on a number line, it's a lot less overwhelming if you do one number at a time. So keep in mind, we're going to be using tonight, we're going to be using a number line. And just like we do in class a lot of times, I like to label my benchmarks on my number line. So if I have a number line that looks like this, keep in mind, we're going to be starting out with 0 because all of the numbers we're using are at smallest 0. And when we're talking about a fraction that's not a mixed number, we know that the biggest it's possibly going to be, sorry, that's not a very good one. We know the biggest that it could possibly be is 1 whole. So I like to start my number line to go between 0 and 1 whole. Now, in between there, we could write our benchmarks. And I like to write our benchmarks as decimals and fractions. So I'm going to write in the center of my number line, 1/2. And remember 1/2, that's hard to see, 1/2 is the same exact thing as 5/10. So right below that, I'm going to write 5/10. Because remember that 5 is half of 10. Remember that right in between 0 and 1/2 is where 1/4 or 1/4 is going to go. So I'm going to write 1/4. And remember, we've talked a lot about how 1/4 is equivalent to 25 out of 100 or 25 hundredths. So I'm going to write that as a decimal. And we know that 3/4 falls in between 1/2 and a whole, and it is equivalent to 75 hundredths. So anytime you're looking at numbers, always put them on a number line so that we can get a good idea of how does this number compare to another number. Now, going back to this page, my first strategy that I always use when looking at fractions and decimals is I always compare them to the most useful benchmark fraction, in my opinion, which is half. So I'm going to look through each of those numbers, and the first question I'm going to ask myself is this number bigger than half, or is this number smaller than half? So let's start here with 2/3. So we have 2/3. I like to look first at the denominator. I see a 3 down here, and I'm going to ask myself, if I were to split 3 in half, what is half of 3? Well, because 3 is an odd number, it's kind of a little bit more tricky, but we can figure out what half of 3 is. Half of 3 is exactly 1/2. So I would ask myself, is 2 bigger than the halfway point? So is it bigger than 1/2? Or is it smaller than the halfway point? Is it smaller than 1/2? And I know that 2 is bigger than 1/2. So I'm just going to take this and I'm just going to write a B below it. I've seen people do this on their homework. Just write a B for bigger or an S for smaller. So 2/3 is going to be bigger. Same thing with 7/12. I'm going to look at my denominator and say, well, what is half? The halfway point would be 6/12. So 7/12 would be slightly bigger than that. Let's go to my other fraction before we talk about the decimal. So 2/5. If I look at my denominator here, another odd number, so it makes it a little bit tougher. Half of 5 is 2.5, and 2 is smaller than that. So 2/5 is going to be smaller than half. And my last fraction is 9/12. Half of 12 is 6, we've already said. So 9/12 is going to be bigger than half. Which leaves us only with our 2 decimals. Remember, we just labeled on our number line our halfway point for decimals, which is 5/10. And here we have 1/10, which is smaller than 5/10, so it's smaller than half. And we have 9/10, which is bigger than 5/10, so it's bigger than half. So smaller and bigger. Now, the reason I like to start off with this strategy is because once you've finished this point, you've already started to group your numbers into two groups. It's kind of like in class when I ask you if you're bigger than half to go to one side of the room, if you're smaller than half to go to the other side of the room. It's because we already can group our numbers into smaller groups, which makes it easier to order them. So I'm going to start off by just looking at my fractions or decimals that are smaller than half, which would be 2/5 and 1/10. So I'm going to go over here. And what I like to do is one at a time order these on my line. So it seems to be easier sometimes to order decimals first, so that's what I'm going to do. So I know my 1/10 is, let's use green here. I know my 1/10 is, if I look in the tens place here of my 2500ths, 1 would be smaller. So 1 would be smaller than 2500ths, which tells us that it's going to be somewhere over in here. I know 1/10 is pretty close to 0, so I'm going to go over here and I'm going to put 1/10 right next to my 0. Now I go back. My other number up here is 2/5. Now 2/5 could be put on this line in a couple different ways. I know that 2/5, I've already decided that it's smaller than a half. I like to then go to my second benchmark, like I just did with 1/10 2, which is 1/4, and compare and say, is 2/5 bigger than 1/4 or is it smaller than 1/4? So you have a couple strategies. We know what 1/4 is as a decimal because we've already decided that. We can either A, figure out what 2/5 is as a decimal, or B, we can find common denominators between 1/4 and 2/5. I find it a little bit easier to figure out what 2/5 is as a decimal. So I'm going to write 2/5, just like this. I know that my decimal place values are tenths, hundredths, and thousandths. So I'm going to change this 5 into a 10 in this case because it's an easy way to do that. And by multiplying by the same number on the top and the bottom, I get 4/10, which as a decimal would look like this. 0.4 or 4/10. Now, once it looks like this, it's a little bit easier for me to place upon that number line. I know that 5/10 is equal to a half, so 4/10 would be just slightly smaller than a half. Now, if I go back and place it over here, I know that 4/10 is bigger than my 2500ths, but it's smaller than my half. And I might even ask myself, well, what's it closer to? Well, it's only 1/10 away from a half, so I know it's going to be even closer to 1/2. So I'm going to go over here, and I'm going to write 2/5. Now, you may ask yourself, well, why didn't I have to compare it to this one? Well, I already knew that this one was smaller than 1/4. 1/10 is smaller than 1/4. And 2/5 is bigger than 1/4. So therefore, I didn't need to even look at that because I used my benchmark fractions. Now, just like that, we're finished with two of our numbers. So I'm going to go back to our original numbers, and I am actually going to erase these ones because we're finished with them. The reason I like to erase them after we're finished is just because it's less overwhelming if you just see smaller pieces. So next thing, I'm going to get one of these out of the way just because this decimal at the end seems easier to order. I'm going to take 9/10, and I'm going to go to my number line. I know that 5/10 was in the middle, so we said 9/10 is bigger than half. Remember, all these numbers bigger than half are going to go on this side of half. If I look at 3/4 over here, I see a 7 in the tenths place. Remember that 10/10 is equal to 1 whole, so we know that 9/10 is going to be pretty close to that. So I'm going to go over here and I am going to write with green, I'm going to write 9/10. And the reason I like to get rid of my decimals is because that kind of helps a little bit. To get something out of the way. So let me get rid of my decimal. Now we're stuck with 3 fractions, and I know some of you guys don't really care for fractions too much. So we're going to look at a couple strategies. So keep in mind, the idea is to figure out what is bigger than half and what is smaller than a half first, which we've already done. And then we're going to use our other benchmark, which on this side happens to be 3/4. So I'm going to start off comparing 2/3 to 3/4. And one way I'm going to do that, because we have two different fractions, is I'm going to take both of those fractions, 2/3 and 3/4, just like this. And I'm going to make common denominators. Remember, with common denominators, one thing we can do is, if you want, you can list multiples for each of these. In this case, I have a 3 and a 4. So I'm going to say 3, 6, 9, 12. I'm going to say 4, 8, 12. When you come up with a number that is the same, just like we've done here, that's going to be your common denominator. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to switch each of these into 12ths. Remember, whatever you multiply the denominator by, the numerator has to be multiplied by 2. So 3 times what is 12? That would be times 4. So 2 times 4 would give us 8. 2/3 is the same as 8/12. What times 4 is equal to 12? That would be 3. So 3 times 3 is going to give us 9. Now, when those pieces are the same size, you'll notice we have 12ths here and 12ths here. It's much easier to tell which is bigger. Just by doing this, I've figured out that 8/12 is just a little bit smaller than 9/12, so therefore 2/3 must be a little bit smaller than 3/4. That's not the only way to do that, but that's a strategy that I use. We could have also turned 2/3 into a decimal. So I'm going to go over here to the other side, and notice I've put 2/3 just a little bit smaller than 3/4. And just like that, I'm down to only 2 fractions. Now, keep in mind this takes a little bit of time, but if you go through each of these steps and you use these strategies we've talked about, I think that's going to help you quite a bit. Now, I'm left with these two numbers. You could choose whichever one you wanted to choose. Just because these are the same size pieces, I know that 9/12 is going to be bigger than 7/12. So it's helpful if I can figure out how big one of these is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to 9/12. Something I notice about 9/12 is that this number can actually be simplified. Anytime you can simplify a number, it might turn into something that you're more familiar with. So I would use that as a strategy. In this case, I would ask myself, what number could divide both 9 and 12? And if we really think about it, 3 is a factor of both of those. So I'm going to divide both of them by 3. And you'll notice really fast that 9 divided by 3 is 3. And 12 divided by 3 is 4. So 9/12 is the exact same thing as 3/4. Simplifying can be a really good strategy to help when you're ordering fractions and decimals. So I'm going to go back to the other side, to my number line, and I'm going to put 9/12 exactly the same as 3/4, because it is. Just keep in mind that the only reason it takes more of these 12th pieces here is because they're smaller than the 4th pieces. So they're smaller, so it takes more of them. They're actually 3 times smaller, so it takes 3 times as many of them. And just like that, we only have one number left, which is 7/12. Now, I know because we had just said that 7/12 has to be less than 9/12, but I don't know how it compares to 2/3. So I would, again, probably choose to make a common denominator. And interestingly enough, earlier, we already figured out that 2/3 is equal to 8/12. So I know just by doing that 7/12 is going to be slightly smaller. So on my number line, when I put that on my number line, I'm just going to put it slightly smaller than 2/3. The other thing you might know about 7/12 is if 6/12 is a half, 7/12 is just a little bit bigger than half, and that may be something you think too. So these are some strategies I use when I'm ordering fractions and decimals. Just to give you a reminder, always make sure to order into bigger than half and smaller than half. Always make sure to use common denominators. We did that. We, when we could, changed a number into a decimal. Sometimes that's helpful for people, and remember that always works. And then the last thing we did was we simplified. And we did all of this on a number line to really help us to see where these numbers were and how close they were to one another. So the next time you have to order fractions and decimals, I hope these things help you. Try these strategies, and I think they'll be helpful. So thank you guys for watching tonight, and I'll see you in class tomorrow.